Now, we wouldn't call this island mystical unless there were tales of giants living here. The island of Gozo in Malta is the backdrop of an ancient legend. Malta is an island country located in the Mediterranean Sea, just south of Europe. It's a very strategically located archipelago. Throughout history, it was ruled by many different societies, such as the Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, and Carthaginians. One cold night, thousands of years ago, a farmer noticed the sky turn orange, then red, when he heard a loud thump. Although the ground seemed to be moving, this wasn't an earthquake. When he looked toward the woods, he saw a giant silhouette, taller than the trees. As he fearfully approached, he realized it was a woman, a giant woman. She introduced herself as Sansuna. Unlike the terrible giants of many tales, Sansuna didn't want to exterminate the human race. She was loving and caring. She told the farmer that she and her people could help protect their land from invaders. The locals were pretty interested in this offer. Since Malta is located in an important commercial route, it was constantly being invaded. The story says that Sansuna settled in Malta, and sooner rather than later, she was moving things around. And when I say things, I mean monoliths. Sansuna carried huge stones on her shoulder to build a magnificent temple called Gigantia, which means place of giants. She even did this while holding her half-giant, half-human kid on the other shoulder. Some say Sansuna lived exclusively on beans and honey, although others replaced honey with water. The funniest bit here is that Malta is the 10th smallest country in the world, but it somehow managed to host giants. Hey, go figure. The temple looked like a giant game of Tetris, with some stones weighing as much as 20 elephants. Some of these monolithic rocks are so heavy, scholars guess it would take 50 men working together to lift just one stone. Now, as much as this is entertaining, humans never proved giants were real, so this story couldn't be true. There's a brief mention of a species of giants called the Nephilim in some ancient texts. The Nephilims would have been terrible giants that wreaked havoc on the earth and only survived until the Great Flood. But nobody ever found real proof of this species really existing on Earth, until this came along. The world of Maltese archaeology unearthed quite a few shocking things in the past years. One of them are known as the hypogeum skulls. Hypogeum is the Greek word for underground, and this incredible site was discovered in the first decade of the 20th century. Back then, Malta's National Museum director received an important phone call. Someone had accidentally dug some impressive bones and asked him to come check it out. The hypogeum looked like an underground city, filled with mazes and rooms that stretched along multiple floors. They were all made with similar limestones as the Maltese temples above ground. The hypogeum was filled with important relics and artifacts. Scientists quickly understood that the hypogeum was built as a type of final resting place for locals. So, along with skulls, they found a lot of bones and skeletons. One of these artifacts were skulls, but these weren't regular human skulls. Rather, they were of the elongated type. To make matters worse, these skulls were hidden from the public for years. People started to talk and created a bunch of theories behind it. The truth is that this discovery was a turning point for Maltese archaeology, although scientists didn't know what to do with it. Some wondered if these skulls were natural or manipulated, since they knew some cultures in the world used head binds to alter their skulls. Other scientists threw in the hypothesis of little gray people or even the legendary giants. Some say that the elongated skulls could have been sculptures that worshipped otherworldly deities. There was no way to confirm any of these theories, so the question remained: who were the builders of Malta's megalithic temples? Now let's take a look at what scientists know. The Maltese megalithic temples have been standing strong since 3500 BCE, which is even older than the pyramids of Egypt. The main dilemma here is that these temples were built even before we invented writing, yet they required advanced technological skills to exist. The Gigantia Temple seems too absurd to have been built by humans. The South Temple has a corridor with 4 oval rooms on the sides, looking like a big shamrock leaf. In one of these rooms, scientists found altars decorated with spiral patterns. It looked like an altar of some sort. indicating early Maltese people used them for ritualistic purposes. The North Temple is similar but smaller, with a very low entrance that makes people crouch down to get inside. You get it? You need to bow down to their deities in order to get into this sacred place. I mean, one can't help but wonder about the secret reasons these ancient builders had to build such a huge temple. I'm thinking they probably cast one of Daenerys' dragons to move the monoliths around. Yeah, I'm joking here. But hey, remember the entrance to King's Landing? Yup, the series used the Medina Gates in Malta as the exterior of King's Landing during Episode 3 of Season 1. Anyways, back to the giants. The ritualistic theory of the whole thing won a few points when archaeologists uncovered these mysterious figures. They're popularly known as fat ladies. These tiny statues have round bodies and faces that show how much they enjoyed life. They kind of look like a miniature Sunsana, the giantess we talked about. Scientists believe these were statues that celebrated well-being and prosperity. It does prove that the people of the time had advanced craftsmanship skills, and they were pretty intentional with their constructions and art manifestations. One of these statues is known as the Sleeping Lady. This Neolithic piece of art depicts the figure of a large woman lying on her side sleeping. After studying it deeper, scientists guessed this statue was meant to represent the Great Reaper. It was found in the hypogeum, which we now know was a huge resting place. This specific statue is different from all the other fat ladies, starting with the hair and the embroidered skirt. Then there's this statue. This is supposed to represent an 8-foot-tall woman and the rim of her skirt. She was discovered in the most unusual of ways. A farmer was trying to plow his field, but he kept hitting large blocks of stone. All the way back in 1915, the farmer called Malta's National Museum director and asked him to come check it out. Some think this is all the proof you need to confirm that Sunsana was real. Others aren't all that sure. But that's not all. The place where this giant statue was buried revealed one of Malta's most impressive archaeological sites, the Tarsian temples. The temples were made from limestone blocks. Some are 20 feet tall and weigh around 20 tons. Zamet, the museum director, kept digging and discovered multiple sites made of megalithic stones. All of them supposedly built by Stone Age farmers, all stranded on a remote island in the Mediterranean Sea thousands of years ago. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, look at these temples in Manidra. This is probably the world's earliest calendar. On the equinoxes, the sun passes directly through the main doorway, straight down the central axis. On the solstices, there are two superb variations. During the summer solstice, the rays fall on the edge of the megalith to the left of the doorway, and during the winter, the rays fall to the right side of the doorway. It's astronomical precision at its finest. And what about the structures in the Hall Tarsian that we've already talked about? This complex is the oldest one in all of Malta. It was built with the purpose of doing animal offerings to deities. Scientists confirmed this by unearthing numerous animal bones buried in the soil. They also found a great collection of spirals, indicating that the locals also used this temple for ritualistic purposes. Overall, there are 7 megalithic temples in Malta, each more impressive than the other. Scholars keep on digging to see if they can uncover the truth, much like researchers do with the pyramids of Egypt, the lost Mayan cities in the Americas, and other sites.
If everything had gone according to the original plan, you wouldn't recognize the Washington Monument today. The designer, Robert Mills, wanted to create a temple-like building with 30 tall stone columns and statues of important people from American history. There would have also been a statue of George Washington riding a horse and a 600-foot-tall Egyptian-style obelisk in the middle. In 1848, they placed the first stone of the monument in a big ceremony with thousands of people. Abraham Lincoln also was there, although he was not yet famous. They started building, but by 1854, they ran out of money when the monument was only 150 feet tall. Finally, 22 years later, President Ulysses Grant gave the project federal money to finish the monument. By then, tastes had changed, and they decided not to build the temple part of the base. Since the project had stopped for so long, the stone colors couldn't match perfectly. That's why the bottom of the monument is lighter than the top. When it was finished, the Washington Monument was the tallest structure in the world. But 5 years later, the Eiffel Tower was built, and the monument had to give away the champion's title. Years before the JFK airport started functioning, the Empire State Building was supposed to serve as one. Yep, the iconic New York's landmark antenna wasn't designed for King Kong to climb it, but as a mooring mast for giant airships. The leader of a group of investors erecting the building, Alfred E. Smith, imagined that passengers would walk down a ramp and be out on the streets of New York just 7 minutes later. But the man in charge of a famous airship called the Graf Zeppelin didn't think this idea would work out. He said that landing a dirigible was very difficult and needed lots of workers on the ground to help, plus long ropes to tie the airship down. A dirigible tried to dock at the Empire State Building only once in history, in September 1931. The pilot had to carefully steer the airship around the top of the building for 3 minutes. The winds were really strong, blowing at 40 miles per hour, which made it really tricky. Traffic in the streets below stopped for over half an hour as people watched the airship trying to land. Mount Fuji has become one of the symbols of Japan as a mountain peak, but it's actually formed by 3 different peaks. There's a legend that says Mount Fuji was created in one night by an earthquake in 286 before the Common Era, but geologists believe it's much older. The first of the peaks began developing about 700,000 years ago. 2 old mountains are part of Fuji's foundation. About 100,000 years ago, a new part grew on top of these. The volcano we see today started forming 11 to 8,000 years ago. Compared to other volcanoes, it is still considered pretty young and active, although the last time it erupted was over 300 years ago. Whenever there's a serious earthquake in the area, there's a risk it will erupt again. Thousands of people still climb it every year. You could technically live inside the Eiffel Tower if you really wanted to. Gustav Eiffel designed the tower to feature a private apartment for himself right at the top of the construction. He left the place all neat and tidy with warm wallpaper, soft chintzes, wooden cabinets, and even a grand piano. These days, the only tenants of the apartment are 2 mannequins, that of Eiffel himself and of Thomas Edison. The famous inventor was a frequent guest in the apartment. If you buy a ticket to the top of the tower, you can get a sneak peek of the apartment through a window as a bonus. The Statue of Liberty also has a hidden room. It's in the torch. This part of the statue is 29 feet long and is made of copper. It sits on a steel framework that was designed by Gustav Eiffel. Yes, the same person who created the Eiffel Tower. Unfortunately, you can't visit the torch as a tourist ever since it was completely closed back in 1916. But they placed a camera there in 2011 to allow people to enjoy live streaming of the panoramic view from the torch. If you ever pass through Trafalgar Square, you'll surely miss London's smallest police station, since it's hidden beneath a lamppost inside an ornamental light fitting. The reason why it was placed there back in the 1920s was to let police officers be close to public rallies. They happened quite a lot in that area. Some even said it used to have a direct phone line to Scotland Yard. It's now used as a cleaning station, so there isn't much to see there, apart from some mops. It took 14 years to finish the huge profiles of 4 American presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt into the southeastern face of Mount Rushmore. If current records are true, there's an incomplete secret room behind Abraham Lincoln's head. It was meant to become the Hall of Records open for visitors. It would keep important artifacts and documents of American history, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. A year into the construction, the authorities decided it was more important to finish the president's profiles, so they cut funding for the project. So the secret room was never finished, and visitors to Mount Rushmore can't see it. The Passetto di Borgo is a special hidden walkway that connects the Vatican City to a nearby fortress called Castel Sant'Angelo. It's around half a mile long and was built in the 13th century. It was used by popes to escape from the Vatican when they were in danger, and it was used this way at least twice in history. A statue of Leonardo da Vinci, located at Rome's Fiumicino Leonardo da Vinci Airport, was first unveiled back in 1960. During a recent renovation, one of the workers made a mysterious discovery during this process. He found a small hole somewhere in the middle of the statue, at a height of about 30 feet. After it was carefully opened, they found two parchments inside. The first document, written in classical Latin, told the history of the area that now houses the airport. The other one had a list of people who attended the inauguration of the statue. There's a huge network of catacombs under Paris, stretching for around 174 miles. It's one of the largest grave sites in the world, and brave tourists are allowed to visit only a small section of it. But some people manage to get into the restricted passages to throw picnics and parties, and even start businesses there. Businesses like a fully functioning movie theater with an underground restaurant and bar. The law enforcement officers who found it believe it must have been built by some secret society. Whoever arranged it was trying to hide the entrance, making it look like a construction site. A motion sensor would set off a video camera, recording anyone who tried to sneak in. Then, a sound of a barking dog would play, hoping to scare off intruders. Those who weren't scared away would get into an underground theater with rows of seats carved into the rock, a big movie screen, and a projector just like in a regular movie theater. The experts were surprised that the electricity worked so well underground to power it all, so a team came back to check it out. But when they returned, everything had been removed. The electricity lines were cut, and the items were gone. All that was left was a note saying, "Do not try to find us."
Most people know that pyramids were built as grand tombs for the pharaohs, designed to ensure they had a smooth journey to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, was constructed for the pharaoh Khufu. But what most people don't know is that this whole pyramid building trend started right here with the step pyramid of Djoser about 4,700 years ago. This massive structure was built for Pharaoh Djoser, a ruler from Egypt's 3rd dynasty. It rises 7 layers high above the ground and stands about 200 feet tall. We think of it today as a phenomenal architectural project, but for ancient Egyptians, the step pyramid of Djoser turned out to be more like a massive experiment, a trial run, if you will, to perfect their building skills before they moved on to even more ambitious pyramids. Reaching new heights is super exciting, but the real mystery is what is going on below the ground. In this pyramid's underground labyrinth, there is a network of tunnels stretching about 3.5 miles long, and some researchers believe these tunnels might have been part of a sophisticated water system that could completely change what we think about pyramid construction. Let's talk about this massive complex located in Saqqara. Surrounding the pyramid, there's what's known as a dry moat, a continuous trench that is up to 164 feet wide and almost 2 miles long. It forms a sort of rectangular shape around the pyramid. This trench has an average depth of about 65 feet. Now, if you were to add up all the earth and rock they dug out to create this moat, it would be about 10 times the volume of the step pyramid itself. For the longest time, people just assumed this trench was nothing more than a huge quarry, a place where they dug up stone and clay to build the step pyramid. Makes sense, right? But when you take a closer look, it doesn't add up. The trench is too narrow and deep to be practical for mining, and its layout doesn't match anything we know about ancient Egyptian quarrying methods. Plus, some sections of the trench are actually covered with a rocky ceiling, which would have made it nearly impossible to use as a quarry. Another theory suggests that the dry moat had some kind of spiritual significance. Maybe it was a sacred place, where souls of nobles gathered to serve the late king in the afterlife. There are even niches in the walls that work as a hint at this spiritual function. But most researchers believe that this purpose likely developed much later, long after the complex was built for Djoser. So what was the moat really designed for? In 2020, a researcher came up with a pretty intriguing idea. It is possible that this trench was actually designed to collect and manage water, especially after heavy rainfalls. Now, that makes sense when you consider the location. The moat sits in an area that could easily have been flooded by runoff water from nearby plains. This could also explain why the trench wasn't used for new graves until much later when the climate became drier and less prone to flooding. The story becomes even more intriguing, as this trench appears to be part of a larger, more complex hydraulic system within the Djoser complex. It is like the trench has several compartments, carefully carved out of the rock and connected by tunnels. These compartments likely served as a part of a water treatment system, where water would flow from one compartment to the next, getting cleaner as it moved along. Now, here is where things start to tie into the pyramid itself. The Djoser complex has a series of underground shafts, and some researchers think that water from the moat's deep trench might have been used to power a hydraulic lift system, and this giant water-powered elevator could have been used to raise the heavy stones needed to build the pyramid. It worked like a volcano, but instead of lava, water did the heavy lifting. Imagine a big deep hole in the ground at the center of the pyramid site. Inside this hole, there was a huge wooden platform, kind of like a giant raft that could move up and down. When the workers wanted to lift a heavy stone, they would fill the hole with water. As the water rose, the wooden platform started to float up, carrying the stone with it, almost like a giant water-powered elevator. When the stone reached the right height, the workers slid it off the platform and onto the pyramid. The idea is that water from the deep trench, after being cleaned and filtered, would flow into these shafts. A massive float, possibly made of wood, would then rise as the water filled the shaft, lifting the stones up to where they were needed for construction. Once the stone was in place, they'd let the water out, lowering the platform back down to the bottom, ready to lift the next stone. This fancy hydraulic lift system could have been a game changer, making the whole building process a lot faster and more efficient without using a lot of workforce. It is like the ancient Egyptians were already embracing the whole idea of work smarter, not harder. But of course, not everyone is on board with this theory. Some experts argue that the area where the step pyramid of Djoser was built couldn't have held enough water from occasional rains to maintain such a fancy hydraulic system. The main theory suggests that, in the past, there might have been some kind of lake nearby that would have filled up after a period of rain, and this lake could have supplied water to the complex's hydraulic system. But there is no mention of such a lake in any ancient Egyptian writings, so it might be more of a what-if situation than a reality. And then there's the issue of the hard work itself. Remember when I said this method could have allowed the ancient builders to raise stones with far less effort? Well, that might not be entirely true. According to some experts, just building this hydraulic device would have required a lot more heavy work than simply moving the stone blocks using good old-fashioned manpower. And let's not forget, the step pyramid of Djoser is like a baby pyramid compared to those that came later. The stones used for Djoser's pyramid weighed, on average, about 660 pounds each, which is nothing compared to the more than 2.5-ton blocks used later for the pyramid of Chephren. If this cool water lift theory gets completely ruled out, we still need to explain how this pyramid was built in the first place. To answer that, we need to rewind a bit and talk about the original plans. See, before Djoser's tomb became a pyramid, the idea was to construct a simple mastaba. This type of tomb was pretty common in earlier periods, a flat-roofed, rectangular structure with sloping sides. But after the original mastaba was finished, they decided to expand it a bit by adding more layers on top. And then they added even more layers, until the construction reached 6 distinctive steps, each one smaller than the previous. And they probably did all this by raising those heavy stones using ramps, not a water-powered elevator. There is still so much we don't know about the step pyramid of Djoser. More research is definitely needed to fully understand how this system worked, or if it even existed at all. But the idea of using water to help build the pyramid adds a whole new layer to our understanding of ancient Egyptian engineering. It's a powerful reminder of just how clever and resourceful those builders were, using the natural landscape and the power of water to create one of the most iconic monuments in history. If you walk through this small stone doorway in Hierapolis, Turkey, you might never come back alive. Back in ancient times, people thought it was some sort of portal to the underworld. Romans would go in carrying perfectly healthy bulls, but after a few minutes, they would watch these animals collapse as if hit by some mysterious force. But what's even weirder is that nothing happened to people. They could walk in and out just fine. Now, recent studies might have an answer for these eerie happenings, and it all has to do with people's heights. The gate, known as Plutonium, named after Pluto, the deity of the underworld, is a stone doorway leading to a small 32-square-foot cave. But the real danger is what is going on beneath it. Hierapolis is a super active geological area, and there's a big crack under the city that constantly emits volcanic carbon dioxide, which comes up as a visible mist. During the day, the sun dissipates the gas. At night, the gas forms some kind of a carbon dioxide lake on the sheltered arena floor. At dawn, you need to get out of there before it's too late. This whole place can turn particularly life-threatening right before the sun rises, when the carbon dioxide concentration, about 15 inches above the arena floor, reaches 35%. That means birds, bulls, and even humans can suffocate and pass away in just a couple of minutes. But there is a scientific reason that explains how Romans could get out of there unharmed. The carbon dioxide concentration drops quickly with height, so animals perished while their handlers, being taller and standing up, could walk out and breathe safely. Most people can't stay inside the Bagarn fort after sunset. This 16th century fort, located about 146 miles from Delhi, is known as one of the most haunted places in India. During the day, the area is bustling with visitors who can walk through the main gate of this once grand fort city and check out the ruins of temples and palaces. But they will also see this big sign at the gate that dramatically warns everybody that all access is strictly forbidden after dark. That's probably because at night, according to locals, women can be heard screaming and crying in that place, along with the sounds of bangles breaking and strange music. Others have reported seeing shadowy figures and flashing lights among the ruins, or even smelling a strange perfume floating around. Iwatano-Yabushirasu is one of Japan's most restricted forests, located in Ichikawa. The forest itself is a small area, covering just a little more than 40 square yards, and it is mostly a thick patch of mosu bamboo. Its location next to a parking lot and modern buildings makes it seem less intimidating. But don't be mistaken by its appearance. Since at least the 19th century, people have said that anyone who enters this forest is bound to disappear and never be seen again. So, as soon as you arrive, a sign near the forest tells you about its history and the curse believed to be linked to it. Some rumors suggest the creepy presence of an ancient samurai lord walking around. Other legends say that the forest hides a bottomless pit filled with poisonous gas. Whether these stories are true or not, today, the area is enclosed by stone walls, and entry is still strictly prohibited. In a valley called the Dark Entry Forest in Connecticut, you will find Dudleytown, but you definitely shouldn't go inside. Not only has the land been private property since the 1920s, but it is also known as one of the spookiest places on Earth. This place was first settled in the early 1740s, and many of the original settlers were from the Dudley family. That's why it's called Dudleytown. There's a local rumor that the town's founders were descended from Edmund Dudley, an English nobleman who lost his life for treason. The legend says this curse followed the Dudley family all the way across the Atlantic to America, and their misfortune is said to be responsible for crop failures, mental problems, and several tragic incidents in the village. Again, it is all just rumors, since historians haven't found any real evidence to support these claims. Still, the pitch-black surroundings and the eerie Blair Witch Project vibe going on in that place fueled ghost stories in the 1980s. This led to many cases of vandalism in the following decade, and because of that, the landowners closed the area to the public. This old abandoned building used to be the fancy palace of King Farouk's family, who was the penultimate king of Egypt back in 1936. After his family members passed away, the palace was turned into a morgue. Locals say that today, the whole place is super creepy and off-limits. Some people have reported seeing light bulbs flicker and shadows move around, making strange noises. Once, a group of kids allegedly went inside and totally freaked out when they found all the doors had suddenly disappeared, leaving them in complete darkness. They had no choice but to start screaming for help. This Hawaiian island has been off-limits to people for over a century. It's called Niihau and is the smallest inhabited island in Hawaii, covering around 69.5 square miles. It has around 84 residents. The island doesn't have cell phone service, paved roads, or power lines, just solar panels for electricity. A single family has privately owned the island since 1864, when a Scottish farmer bought it for $10,000, which would be around $250,000 today. The island has stayed in the family, passing down to its descendants, the Robinsons. They have kept it private ever since, so access is highly restricted and basically by invitation only. The Erdstall tunnels are a network of about 2,000 mysterious underground passageways mainly found in Central Europe, especially in Austria and Bavaria. These tunnels are usually narrow and cramped, often just wide enough for one person to squeeze through at a time, and they are believed to date back to the Middle Ages, as far back as the 12th century. What's really puzzling about these tunnels is their purpose. Despite a lot of research, nobody really knows why they were built. There is a theory that they were used for storage, but since many of them are below the waterline and occasionally get filled with water, that doesn't seem very practical. These tunnels have very light, almost claustrophobic sections and sudden drops, which doesn't seem practical for other straightforward uses like escape routes, hiding places, or even spiritual purposes. To make things even more mysterious, there is a complete lack of artifacts, which makes it even harder for researchers to figure out what these tunnels were really for. Since 2019, adventurous people can get arrested if they try to climb this rock. Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock, has been off-limits because it is now considered a sacred site for local communities. But the fact that it is also extremely dangerous probably played a big role in the decision to close it off to visitors. This rock is 1,142 feet high, which is about the height of an 80-story building. The climb to the summit can be very slippery, and high temperatures, which can hit 116 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, have led to people passing away from dehydration and heat-related issues. Something even creepier happens at the top of the rock right after storms. When it rains, small tadpole-like crustaceans called shield shrimp hatch in temporary waterholes and rock pools on top of Uluru. These extraterrestrial-looking creatures are about 3 inches long, and they spread their super-resilient eggs everywhere. When enough summer rain comes, they hatch and go wild, feeding on microorganisms and bacteria in the water. How these strange creatures end up in the fleeting pools on top of Uluru is still unclear, but the most likely explanation is that their eggs might travel there with the wind. This place has no time zone, no landmass, and the sun rises and sets here just once a year. For over 400 years, since the era of King Henry VIII, thousands of explorers from all over the world were trying to reach this elusive spot, the North Pole. Some were hoping to find a northwest or northeast passage to China and the Indies, and others just wanted to see what it was like. In 1773, the British Royal Navy organized the first scientific expedition to the North Pole. Constantine Phipps volunteered to lead the mission. It was difficult for the two ships to move through thick ice, and they had to be towed using smaller boats. At some point, Phipps was ready to leave the ships as they saw a completely frozen sea. But in the end, they broke free from the ice and escaped into the open sea to return home without reaching the goal. In 1882, American explorer James Booth Lockwood managed to get closer to the goal than anyone else. By that time, at least 750 people in 42 expeditions had lost their lives trying to make it to the pole. On the 7th of September, 1909, the New York Times came out with a sensational front page. Peary discovers the North Pole after 8 trials in 23 years. Robert E. Peary, an American explorer, claimed to have reached the North Pole in April of the same year. But communication back then was slower than now, so the message had only reached New York by September. A week before the famous headline, the New York Herald had published its own front-page sensation. The North Pole is discovered by Dr. Frederick A. Cook. Cook, another American explorer, had vanished into the Arctic for over a year and had everyone convinced he reached the pole in April 1908, a whole year before Peary. It was tricky to provide evidence any of them had actually reached the goal back then. Their goal was constantly moving on sea ice, unlike the South Pole on steady land, so they couldn't just leave a flag or some other proof there. A travel diary full of details of the journey, including daily distances, the position of the stars, and the like, would probably do as evidence. But neither Cook nor Peary were able to provide any of this backup information. So each of them started a campaign to prove they were honest and trustworthy. Peary was mentioned as the North Pole discoverer until 1988. That's when the National Geographic Society revisited the evidence and found that his records really didn't prove his claim. Cook's claim was neither proven nor disproven. Australian-born British explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins went on his first expedition to the North Pole in 1913. That's when he got the idea to reach the goal by submarine. In 1931, he borrowed a special submarine named O-12 from the U.S. Navy. The future mission had 2 goals: to do scientific experiments while floating on ice and moving underwater, and to reach the North Pole by traveling beneath the ice. They planned to study the weather, take temperature measurements, and collect water samples from both the surface and the sea floor. The submarine Sir Hubert used was brought to a shipyard in New Jersey to be modified. They added the latest scientific equipment and changed the outside so the submarine could travel under the ice. On March 16th, the submarine left the shipyard to start its journey to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York. But even before leaving the Delaware River, they faced delays. A snowstorm forced them to stop at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and they had to stop again to get more fuel. When the submarine was entering New York Harbor, a crew member who was just 27 years old fell overboard and drowned. The submarine was officially renamed Nautilus, and the grandson of Jules Verne, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which inspired the new name, was there to see it. Before starting their journey, the crew tested the Nautilus in different spots off the New England coast. They faced criticism and were already 2 months behind schedule, so they decided to head straight to England. During their trip across the Atlantic, they sailed into severe storms. On the 13th of June, the starboard engine broke down. Then, the port engine failed because it was overused. While crossing the Atlantic, Sir Hubert Wilkins kept radioing the submarine's position back to the United States. After both engines failed, they sent out an SOS. On June 15th, the USS Wyoming, a huge ship on a training cruise with naval students, reached the Nautilus. The Wyoming towed the broken submarine to Queenstown, Ireland, and then it was taken to Devonport, England for repairs. They had to wait for spare parts from the United States, which caused more delays. Once the Nautilus was fixed, they headed to Bergen, Norway, to meet the submarine science officers and get more equipment. One of the most important additions in Bergen was a diving chamber, which allowed them to lower scientific tools into the water through a special hatch. On August 5th, the Nautilus finally left Bergen and headed north to find ice floes. They had lots of delays because of mechanical problems and storms. One storm even made the submarine tilt at crazy angles. Finally, on August 19th, they saw the first ice floe. For a few days, they followed the ice's edge, looking for a good spot to dive. 3 days later, they tried to dive under the ice, but discovered that the submarine's diving rudders were missing. One diver went overboard to check and saw that someone must have broken off the rudders on purpose. This made Wilkins think that someone on the crew had sabotaged the submarine because they didn't trust the mission. Even without the rudders, Wilkins still wanted to do some of his scientific experiments. On the last day of August, they found a way to force the Nautilus under a 3-foot-thick ice floe. They had to fill the ballast tanks and adjust the trim. They managed to make more dives under this ice this way before the journey ended. After a few more days of trying to do research, Wilkins decided it was too dangerous to stay at sea. The Nautilus arrived at Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago between mainland Norway and the North Pole, on September 8th, after going through the worst storm of the trip. They planned to go to a port in England, but another storm caused a lot of damage and made the engines fail, so they had to stop in Bergen again. After getting permission from the United States Shipping Board, the Nautilus was towed out of Bergen and sunk in a Norwegian fjord on November 13, 1931. In 1958, a U.S. submarine with the same name, Nautilus, became the first vessel that reached the North Pole by traveling under the ice. This Nautilus was much bigger than the submarines that came before it. It was 319 feet long and weighed 3,590 tons. For comparison, the other Nautilus was 175 feet long. Unlike other submarines, the new Nautilus could stay underwater for a longer time because of its special atomic engine didn't need air and only used a tiny amount of nuclear fuel. On July 23, 1958, it left Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on Operation Sunshine. There were 116 people on board: Commander Anderson, 111 officers and crew, and 4 civilian scientists. The Nautilus traveled north through the Bering Strait and only surfaced once at Point Barrow, Alaska. On August 1st, the submarine left the north coast of Alaska and dove under the Arctic ice cap. The submarine traveled at a depth of 500 feet, with the ice above it between 10 to 50 feet thick. At 11:15 p.m. on August 3rd, Commander Anderson told his crew, "For the world, our country, and the Navy, the North Pole." And the Nautilus went right under the North Pole without stopping. On August 5th, the submarine came up in the Greenland Sea, and then 2 days later, it finished its historic trip in Iceland. Now, we wouldn't call this island mystical unless there were tales of giants living here. The island of Gozo in Malta is the backdrop of an ancient legend. Malta is an island country located in the Mediterranean Sea, just south of Europe. It's a very strategically located archipelago. Throughout history, it was ruled by many different societies, such as the Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, and Carthaginians. One cold night, thousands of years ago, a farmer noticed the sky turn orange, then red, when he heard a loud thump. Although the ground seemed to be moving, this wasn't an earthquake. When he looked toward the woods, he saw a giant silhouette, taller than the trees. As he fearfully approached, he realized it was a woman, a giant woman. She introduced herself as Sunsuna. Unlike the terrible giants of many tales, Sunsuna didn't want to exterminate the human race. She was loving and caring. She told the farmer that she and her people could help protect their land from invaders. The locals were pretty interested in this offer. Since Malta is located in an important commercial route, it was constantly being invaded. The story says that Sunsuna settled in Malta, and sooner rather than later, she was moving things around. And when I say things, I mean monoliths. Sunsuna carried huge stones on her shoulder to build a magnificent temple called Gigantia, which means place of giants. She even did this while holding her half-giant, half-human kid on the other shoulder. Some say Sunsuna lived exclusively on beans and honey, although others replaced honey with water. The funniest bit here is that Malta is the 10th smallest country in the world, but it somehow managed to host giants. Hey, go figure. The temple looked like a giant game of Tetris, with some stones weighing as much as 20 elephants. Some of these monolithic rocks are so heavy, scholars guess it would take 50 men working together to lift just one stone. Now, as much as this is entertaining, humans never proved giants were real, so this story couldn't be true. There's a brief mention of a species of giants called the Nephilim in some ancient texts. The Nephilims would have been terrible giants that wreaked havoc on the earth and only survived until the Great Flood. But nobody ever found real proof of this species really existing on Earth, until this came along. The world of Maltese archaeology unearthed quite a few shocking things in the past years. One of them are known as the hypogeum skulls. Hypogeum is the Greek word for underground, and this incredible site was discovered in the first decade of the 20th century. Back then, Malta's National Museum director received an important phone call. Someone had accidentally dug some impressive bones and asked him to come check it out. The hypogeum looked like an underground city, filled with mazes and rooms that stretched along multiple floors. They were all made with similar limestones as the Maltese temples above ground. The hypogeum was filled with important relics and artifacts. Scientists quickly understood that the hypogeum was built as a type of final resting place for locals. So, along with skulls, they found a lot of bones and skeletons. One of these artifacts were skulls, but these weren't regular human skulls. Rather, they were of the elongated type. To make matters worse, these skulls were hidden from the public for years. People started to talk and created a bunch of theories behind it. The truth is that this discovery was a turning point for Maltese archaeology, although scientists didn't know what to do with it. Some wondered if these skulls were natural or manipulated, since they knew some cultures in the world used head binds to alter their skulls. Other scientists threw in the hypothesis of little gray people or even the legendary giants. Some say that the elongated skulls could have been sculptures that worshipped otherworldly deities. There was no way to confirm any of these theories. So the question remained: who were the builders of Malta's megalithic temples? Now let's take a look at what scientists know. The Maltese megalithic temples have been standing strong since 3500 BCE, which is even older than the pyramids of Egypt. The main dilemma here is that these temples were built even before we invented writing, yet they required advanced technological skills to exist. The Gigantea Temple seems too absurd to have been built by humans. The South Temple has a corridor with 4 oval rooms on the sides, looking like a big shamrock leaf. In one of these rooms, scientists found altars decorated with spiral patterns. It looked like an altar of some sort, indicating early Maltese people used them for ritualistic purposes. The North Temple is similar but smaller, with a very low entrance that makes people crouch down to get inside. You get it? You need to bow down to their deities in order to get into this sacred place. I mean, one can't help but wonder about the secret reasons these ancient builders had to build such a huge temple. I'm thinking they probably cast one of Daenerys' dragons to move the monoliths around. Yeah, I'm joking here. But hey, remember the entrance to King's Landing? Yup, the series used the Medina Gates in Malta as the exterior of King's Landing during Episode 3 of Season 1. Anyways, back to the giants. The ritualistic theory of the whole thing won a few points when archaeologists uncovered these mysterious figures. They're popularly known as fat ladies. These tiny statues have round bodies and faces that show how much they enjoyed life. They kind of look like a miniature Sunzana, the giantess we talked about. Scientists believe these were statues that celebrated well-being and prosperity. It does prove that the people of the time had advanced craftsmanship skills, and they were pretty intentional with their constructions and art manifestations. One of these statues is known as the Sleeping Lady. This Neolithic piece of art depicts the figure of a large woman lying on her side sleeping. After studying it deeper, scientists guessed this statue was meant to represent the Great Reaper. It was found in the hypogeum, which we now know is a huge resting place. This specific statue is different from all the other fat ladies, starting with the hair and the embroidered skirt. Then there's this statue. This is supposed to represent an 8-foot-tall woman and the rim of her skirt. She was discovered in the most unusual of ways. A farmer was trying to plow his field, but he kept hitting large blocks of stone. All the way back in 1915, the farmer called Malta's National Museum director and asked him to come check it out. Some think this is all the proof you need to confirm that Sunsana was real. Others aren't all that sure. But that's not all. The place where this giant statue was buried revealed one of Malta's most impressive archaeological sites, the Tarsian temples. The temples were made from limestone blocks. Some are 20 feet tall and weigh around 20 tons. Zamet, the museum director, kept digging and discovered multiple sites made of megalithic stones. All of them supposedly built by Stone Age farmers, all stranded on a remote island in the Mediterranean Sea thousands of years ago. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, look at these temples in Manidra. This is probably the world's earliest calendar. On the equinoxes, the sun passes directly through the main doorway, straight down the central axis. On the solstices, there are two superb variations. During the summer solstice, the rays fall on the edge of the megalith to the left of the doorway, and during the winter, the rays fall to the right side of the doorway. It's astronomical precision at its finest. And what about the structures in the Hall Tarshan that we've already talked about? This complex is the oldest one in all of Malta. It was built with the purpose of doing animal offerings to deities. Scientists confirm this by unearthing numerous animal bones buried in the soil. They also found a great collection of spirals, indicating that the locals also used this temple for ritualistic purposes. Overall, there are 7 megalithic temples in Malta, each more impressive than the other. Scholars keep on digging to see if they can uncover the truth, much like researchers do with the pyramids of Egypt, the lost Mayan cities in the Americas, and other sites. So it turns out that so-called rich countries are facing a big problem. People are not having kids. Not enough, at least. On average, women need to have 2 children to keep things balanced, but they're only having 1, or none at all. This issue comes down to the fertility rate, or simply the average number of kids a woman is expected to have in her lifetime. When that number's too low, it means more people are passing away in these countries than being born, and that can destroy the economy. Think of a rich country – the US, Germany, Japan. Great! Pick any wealthy nation you like, and I can promise you one thing – its fertility rate is below 2.1, and that's a problem. Here's why. Meet Mary and John, and over here we've got Jack and Lucy. That's 4 people total. Now, both couples get married. Mary and John have 2 kids, but Jack and Lucy only have 1. Now, what does that mean? Simple math, we're down by 1 person. And if this keeps happening, generation after generation, the population starts to shrink. The situation gets pretty scary when we zoom in on certain countries. Take Spain, Italy, or Poland. These countries have some of the lowest fertility rates in the European Union, with women there having, on average, just 1 kid. And that's a big problem, because it drags down entire economies. Picture a triangle, young people and workers at the bottom and the elderly at the top. In many rich countries, that bottom part is shrinking fast, with fewer babies being born each year. So it's like this triangle is flipping upside down. Fewer young folks and workers, but more and more older people. With fewer workers and more retirees, the economy struggles to stay balanced. It's like the domino effect. Fewer people working means fewer people paying taxes. Meanwhile, the older population at the top keeps growing. And now we have a way bigger group depending on pensions and stuff like Social Security. So we're left asking, who's going to pay for all these retirements? Now, some countries are in hotter water than others, and South Korea is really feeling the heat. They've got more and more people getting older, while fewer and fewer babies are being born. In fact, they've got the lowest fertility rate in the world. In 2023, it hit rock bottom, 0.72 births per woman. Now, personally, I don't know how you can have 3/4 of a kid, but hey, that's statistics for you. Meanwhile, if things keep going like this, Korea's population could shrink by half by 2100. Over the last 20 years, their authorities have invested at the equivalent of $286 billion in this issue, and they've rolled out a bunch of incentives to turn things around. First up, pocket money. If a married couple in Korea decides to have their first kid, the government hands over about $10,000 split into monthly payments to help out. While that might sound impressive, it's only about 3 times the average monthly wage. And in Seoul, one of the most expensive cities in the world, that doesn't go very far. Next, a home. Paying rent in Seoul is insane, but the government doesn't want people to leave the capital because of it. So they're stepping in. Recently, they've promised to give families around $300 a month to help with housing, until the kid turns 2. Then again, $300 seems great, but it only covers about 11% of the rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in the city center. And last but not least, health care. Hospital bills are covered, but the couple must be married, on paper and everything. South Korea came up with all this to fix the problem. Otherwise, their population might get older, poorer, and more dependent on others for care. But when you think about it, all these incentives really come down to one thing – giving out cash. Even so, their demographic problem hasn't gotten any better, so the authorities had to come up with more creative solutions, like offering jobs with flexible hours for parents with kids under 5. And they can borrow things like toys or strollers from the government, totally for free. So, why don't women want to become mothers? There's a bunch of reasons. But one of the most important is work. Women are getting more education and grabbing more opportunities in the job market than ever before. But a lot of jobs have crazy hours, with people working late every single day. So many women get stuck in that cycle, waking up early, going to work, coming home late, and sleeping. Then it all starts over the next day. They don't have time to meet a partner, and even less time to raise someone. In fact, education in general is one of the biggest reasons why birth rates are dropping. Spending so many years in school, then in college, means women are pushing back the age they have their first kid. Once they finish their education, they often want to focus on work and building their careers before starting a family. So they're not becoming moms in their teens or early 20s anymore. And by the time they hit 30, things aren't much better. Sure, they might finally land a stable job, but most employment policies still don't offer enough support for childcare. But it's not only education. Younger generations are getting delayed in, well, everything. I mean, it's way harder for them to tick off all the adulting boxes, like having a well-paying job or buying a nice house. And these things are usually a big part of whether people decide to start a family or not. Another reason people aren't having kids: putting a new human into this world is expensive and time-consuming. The average childcare costs in Australia, for example, have gone up faster than inflation. School tuition, even for public schools, takes a big chunk out of parents' budgets. Think about it. Computers, uniforms, field trips, extracurricular activities – all that adds up to the cost of financing someone's education. Over 13 years, parents spend over $80,000 on public education. And if we're talking about private schools, that number jumps up to almost $350,000. And don't worry, these costs are just for one kid. Now imagine having 2 or 3. So what is the solution? Well, there are 2 ways to tackle the problem that don't involve pushing the population to have more kids. Nations can keep their population healthier and employed longer, like what Singapore is doing. They're putting a lot of effort into raising the retirement age, offering midlife training, and encouraging companies to hire older workers, like those over 69. Another way is to encourage people from other countries to come in, especially young ones who are ready to work. That's, for example, the strategy Canada uses. Now, if the goal is really to get women to have more kids, a lot of countries use the baby bonus strategy, basically giving money and benefits to families, just like South Korea does. The problem is that some experts say it is pretty ineffective, as financial incentives don't address the complexity of the issue. For them, what these wealthy countries need to do is offer better career and housing opportunities for young people, like giving incentives for companies to offer more flexible hours or work-from-home options for young parents. They also need to push strategies to lower the cost of housing, especially in big cities. Plus, they need to focus more on the aging population, using technological innovations to support them. That would help not just parents, but families as a whole. So, what do you think? You have an hour before you take your last breath, even though just a second ago you were perfectly healthy and nothing posed any danger to your life. Well, the good news is your life can still be saved. Effective antivenoms are available, but if you choose to neglect the sting, you'll bite the dust for sure. This camouflage artist is the world's most lethal fish. In total, there are around 1,200 venomous fish on our planet, but the stonefish is the toughest one. They've got 13 dorsal fins that can inject extremely poisonous venom. Remember I mentioned camouflage skills? It's the main twist to this story. You see, unlike sharks or any other predator fish, the stonefish won't attack you. It's not a predator, it's prey. So, to stay safe, it needs to somehow protect itself. Thus, it developed a super skill of turning into a stone, sort of. So if you ever get stung by this guy, it's not because it's aggressive, it's because of an unfortunate course of events. Most people had this unpleasant experience just because they accidentally stepped on a stonefish while it was pretending to be a stone or coral on the bottom. As you might have guessed, something that can easily pretend to be a stone doesn't exactly look cute. These guys are scaleless, their skin is covered in multiple warts, and they are multicolored. You can see shades of gray, brown, and patches of orange, red, and yellow. Sometimes they can even be covered in algae. They occupy quite a large territory in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, which means they're everywhere, from Mauritius to Queensland in Australia. Okay, we're going to need a disclaimer here. This fact is very sensitive, but if you want to live your life long and healthy, I suggest you don't skip it. This is a fly. Pretty harmless and definitely way less powerful than you, a human being, are. Yet, chances are that this gentle buddy can destroy your body. Now here's how the story goes. Some time ago, a lady from the UK decided to go on a cool trip to South America. Sounds exotic and not banal at all. Rochelle, who was 27 back then, went to Peru with her boyfriend. When she got back to her home country, she started having severe headaches. She couldn't understand what was going on. Then, half of her face felt terrible discomfort, and suddenly, some weird sound in her head started haunting her. One day, she went to bed, only to wake up the next morning to see that her pillow was soaking wet with some weird liquid. Not blood, not water, just some substance. She rushed to the hospital, where doctors said she had an ear infection. But when doctors looked closer, they saw a hole in her ear canal. It was around half an inch big, but it was swarming with maggots. Yeah, ooh. Now, Rochelle was lucky. The emergency brain scan showed no major damage whatsoever. The eardrum, blood vessels, facial nerves, they were all right. The big question was how to make the maggots leave poor Rochelle's ear. We all get it, it's pretty tight inside the ears, and even small forceps weren't very helpful. So to save the lady, the doctors decided to use olive oil. They expected the maggots to drown, and indeed 2 maggots did. Yet there were 8 more. The most horrifying thing was that the lab analysis showed that a New World screwworm, that's the official name of the fly that interfered with Rochelle's health, had laid eggs in the ear canal that the maggots were chewing. But how on earth did this happen? Well, while she was on vacay in Peru, she once walked through a swarm of flies. One of them got into her ear. She shooed it away, but it had more than enough time to lay eggs inside. Doctors helped Rochelle evict the unwanted guest, and luckily, there won't be any long-term consequences. But we all get it that it could have been much worse. Now, I don't need to tell you that caving is extremely dangerous, do I? Back in June 1990, a man called Gary Lutz took his sons, Buddy and Tim, on a spelunking adventure to West Virginia's New Trout Cave. He packed food, water, and spare headlamps. But here's where he messed up. He left the pack behind when they reached the maze, a tight spot with jagged rocks. He figured they'd grab the supplies before their headlamps ran out of charge. Oops, bad move. The boys' headlamps went dark soon after, and their attempts to backtrack got them lost. Then, Lutz's headlamp ran out of charge too, plunging them into total darkness. For 5 horrific days, they had no food, no water, and no light. They started coughing up cave dust and hallucinating from dehydration. Luckily, someone noticed that their car had been parked for days and called the authorities. The rescue team pointed out that the family had broken the cardinal rules of caving. Always carry 3 sources of light each, and always tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. Sadly, some tourists never go back from vacation. They become statistics. And some people sometimes have a narrow escape from the Grim Reaper without even knowing it. Just an example here. A tourist in Australia filmed themselves handling a super dangerous creature and uploaded the footage to Reddit. In the video, the tourist is holding a blue-ringed octopus, with Mandarin writing on the screen saying, "Such a beautiful octopus." After filming, they shake the octopus off their hand and luckily put it back into the water before it could sting them. The thing is, the blue-ringed octopus is one of the world's most dangerous marine animals. It packs enough venom to make 26 adults kick their buckets. The tourist had no clue how dangerous it was. People on Reddit were freaking out. One person commented, "Do they even know how lucky they are to be alive after doing something that monumentally stupid?" A woman from New Hampshire got some nasty burns after veering off the trail in Yellowstone National Park and falling into scalding water near the Old Faithful geyser. The 60-year-old, along with her husband and their dog, had left the safety of the boardwalk and was walking off the designated trail near Mallard Lake Trailhead when she broke through the thin crust over the water. She ended up with second and third-degree burns on her lower leg. Luckily, her husband and the dog were fine, but the lady was rushed to a hospital for treatment. Now, park officials are reminding everyone to stick to the boardwalks and trails in hydrothermal areas and be super cautious. The ground there is fragile and thin, with scalding hot water just below the surface. Pets are allowed in some developed areas of Yellowstone, but they're not permitted on boardwalks, hiking trails, in the backcountry, or in thermal areas. Hot springs in Yellowstone have injured and made people meet their early demise more than any other natural feature. At least 22 people have passed away from hot spring-related injuries since 1890. Hey, what's cooking? Oh, it's you. Jumping off a bridge into a river filled with crocodiles. What could possibly go wrong? Turns out, a lot. One New Year's Eve, Australian tourist Aaron Langworthy decided to try bungee jumping off a bridge that connects Zimbabwe and Zambia, right near Victoria Falls. It's a 360-foot drop of pure adrenaline. But for Langworthy, things went sideways when her bungee cord snapped, sending her plunging into the Zambezi River, which is known to be home to plenty of crocodiles. Now, Erin herself says it was a miracle she survived. When she fell, she blacked out on impact and felt like she'd been slapped all over, but the cold water shocked her back to consciousness. Now, it's easy to judge tourists for taking risks like this, but bungee jumping has been a thing at this spot for over a decade, drawing more than 50,000 tourists each year and bringing in much-needed revenue for both Zimbabwe and Zambia. The authorities claim bungee jumping is safe. The probability of an accident like Aaron had is 1 in 500,000 jumps. So I think Aaron should go buy a lottery ticket. Around 2,500 years ago, an earthquake completely changed the course of one of the largest and most famous rivers on the planet, the Ganges. Now, it's normal for rivers not to sit in one place, so if you live next to one, it could also just disappear without a trace or flood the whole city one day. In the case of the Ganges River, a supermassive earthquake became the reason for this dramatic change. Scientists say it might happen again, and it would be a huge problem for millions of people who depend on this river. The Ganges River starts as small streams in the Himalayas and travels a long way, over 1,500 miles. Along its journey, it meets other big rivers before all the water flows into the Bay of Bengal. The Ganges has the largest delta in the world among all rivers. Just like many other rivers in the region, it slowly changes its path over time. These changes, if they happen when a river wears away its banks, usually takes a long time, sometimes decades. Scientists have discovered that the Ganges-Brahmaputra river system has shifted several times over the last 6,000 years. When they looked at satellite images of the Ganges Delta, they noticed something interesting. There was a crescent-shaped dip in the ground about 28 miles away from where the river is flowing now. This depression was over 1 mile wide and stretched for many miles. They thought it might have been an old main channel of the Ganges River a long time ago. In 2018, the team decided to visit the area to check it out for themselves and take samples to learn more about it. While driving back home, they noticed a pit where someone was digging dirt to create a pond. The next day, they planned to fill it with water, but the researchers spotted something strange in the dirt. There were vertical bands of light-colored sand mixed into the darker mud. These special layers are clues from the past. They show that an ancient earthquake made sand and water shoot up from below the ground and created sand volcanoes that were trapped in time. The scientists studied the sand and mud and figured out that these earthquakes happened around 2,500 years ago and were strong, with magnitudes of 7 to 8. The epicenter was over 110 miles away from the main stem of the river. but it was powerful enough to displace it. It could have affected around 140 million people. The Ganges-Brahmaputra system is close to spots where Earth's tectonic plates meet, so earthquakes happen here often. There's no danger right now, but scientists think that another massive earthquake could happen in the next few hundred or thousand years. It could threaten up to 170 million people. That's about half the population of the US. No one can predict exactly when an earthquake will happen or how strong it will be. Learning how earthquakes in the past moved rivers helps scientists figure out patterns and make guesses about similar events in the future. This knowledge could help us prepare better and create safety plans before another big earthquake strikes. Now, the Ganges isn't the only river at risk. The Yellow River, the Irrawaddy River, and rivers in the United States like the Klamath and San Joaquin all face similar dangers. The mighty Mississippi River has also switched its path many times over the last 7,000 years. Right now, there's a huge system of dams and barriers called a control structure in central Louisiana. This structure's job is to stop the Mississippi from spilling over its banks and joining a nearby river. But scientists think that, in theory, these barriers wouldn't handle mega floods. So the Mississippi could break free and change its course again. This would cause massive problems, especially in southern Louisiana. One of the recent examples when a river changing its course caused disaster was the Kosi River in India. In August 2008, over just a few days, the river's path shifted by almost 60 miles, which is a huge change. Floods happen in some parts of the state rather often, but they hadn't seen such strong ones in over 50 years. They affected around 1,000 villages and 3 million people, and about 1 million people had to be evacuated to safety. Since many of these people hadn't faced floods in so long, they weren't ready to handle it quickly. It caused even more damage to their homes and lives. Scientists have been trying for decades to figure out what exactly makes rivers suddenly change their course. A new study explains that two things work together to make a river to do it. This process is called evulsion. First, there's the setup, which is like building up tension before something big happens. Over time, sediment, sand, dirt, and other stuff carried by the river gets deposited in certain places. It either raises the river above the land around it or makes a nearby slope steeper than the river's current path. Then there's the trigger, which is like the final straw that makes everything happen. This trigger could be a big flood, an earthquake, or even something like a pile of logs blocking the water. Now, researchers looked at satellite images of about 170 cases of evulsion from the past 50 years. They noticed these events happen most often near river mouths and near mountains. Rivers were about 3 times more likely to change course in these places than in the areas between them. They also studied 58 river channels in detail, using super clear maps to measure super elevation. That's how high the river is compared to the land around it. They also measured slope advantage. That's how steep a new path might be compared to the river's current one. They found that near mountains, rivers often pile up so much sediment that they become super elevated and spill over. But near river mouths, like in deltas, rivers need a steep slope advantage to break through the mud and form a new path. These two factors work together like a seesaw. If one is stronger, the other doesn't need to be as strong for an evulsion to happen. To figure out where a river might go if it changes course, the researchers created a smart computer algorithm. This tool uses maps to measure the terrain steepness and the river's flow to predict where the river might move. They tested it on 10 past evulsions, and it correctly guessed the path every single time. Scientists hope they could use these findings to protect people living near rivers from sudden floods. Rivers changing course played a big role in creating one of the first organized administration systems in the world. Scientists found clues for this in the territory of ancient Mesopotamia. This name means the land between two rivers, and it was between the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates. People living there relied on these rivers for water, food, and transportation. Scientists wanted to figure out how these sudden changes in these rivers affected ancient people. To do this, they used two kinds of maps. The archaeological maps show how ancient cities grew over time, including what types of buildings people built. Certain buildings, like big palaces or city walls, could show when each city first had an organized administration. The second kind of map showed where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed long ago. They often shifted, sometimes slowly, and sometimes very quickly and dramatically. Around the year 5000 BCE, Mesopotamia started to become drier and farming became harder. Farmers had to grow their crops near rivers, where they could use the natural floods to water their fields or dig little channels to bring river water to their plants. Because farming was so important, towns and cities grew near the rivers too, so people could stay close to their food. But when a river suddenly changed its course, people didn't give up. They worked together to dig long canals to bring water from the new river path back to their fields. The canals helped them get water again, and the administration buildings showed they were organizing as a community to solve big problems together. On December 5, 1952, a nauseating yellow-gray fog engulfed London, claiming 12,000 lives. This wasn't mere mist, it stank of rotting eggs and stretched 30 miles wide. Buses halted, planes were grounded, and ambulances were trapped. For 5 days, the city vanished in the stench and sludge, streets slick with a black ooze. Those who dared ventured out stumbled blindly, smudging their faces while birds crashed into buildings. With visibility zero, thieves ran rampant, and even indoor shows were canceled. The Great Smoke sent over 100,000 people to hospitals, leaving a grim legacy of demise and decay. The causes of this tragedy started long into the past. Something called pea soup fog became one of the symbols of London in the 19th century. Nature wasn't to blame for this fog. It was caused by people burning coal to heat their homes and run factories. In fact, London's air started getting smoky all the way back in the 13th century, when people began widely using coal. It got worse as the city grew bigger. By the 17th century, people were already complaining about the dirty air. King James I tried to prevent so much coal burning with new laws, but nothing really changed. As more factories popped up during the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, the problem blew out of proportion. The air was full of tiny particles that water clung to and formed dark, heavy clouds. This mix of smoke and fog became so bad, people called it smog. Yep, this word was invented in London in the early 20th century. The smog got so thick sometimes it could last for a whole week, and it made people ill. Some even passed away because of it. Even though the smog was harmful, people didn't want to stop using coal because it gave them jobs and kept their homes warm. So the problem lingered. By the 20th century, thick fogs were happening less frequently, finally, because factories started moving away from the city. But on that December day in 1952, an anticyclone appeared over London. This meant that the cold air near the ground got trapped under warmer air higher up, like a lid keeping everything underneath. Because of this, all the smoke from factories, cars, and home fireplaces couldn't float up and away like usual. Instead, it clung near the ground, mixed with water in the air, and produced an extremely thick, dirty fog. Plus, daylight in December is shorter, and it was really cold, so people had to use even more coal for heating and lighting than they normally did. All this led to a disaster. It was clear that sulfur particles from the burning coal made the fog yellow and smell like rotten eggs. But scientists couldn't figure out why and how these particles turned into sulfuric acid. Decades later, an international team of researchers recreated that scary fog in a lab. They used samples of air and atmospheric measurements from the fog in 2 large Chinese cities that have high levels of sulfur dioxide in the air, just like London during the Great Smoke. They learned that the thick, dirty air, called haze, doesn't form in the same way in London and in China. In London's fog, smoke from burning coal released 2 gases, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. These gases mixed with water droplets in the fog, which made it harmless at first because the water diluted the harmful chemicals. But as the water evaporated and there was nothing to dilute the two dioxides, the fog became very acidic and hazardous to breathe, so it damaged people's lungs. In present-day China, things are a little different. A third chemical, ammonia, joins the mix. Now ammonia, which comes from farms and cars, helps balance out the acidity of the fog, so it's less harmful than London's deadly fog. But the scientists found that cutting down on nitrogen dioxide and ammonia could still help China reduce its air quality problems. They hope that their discovery will help both understand London's past fogs and give China ideas for making its air cleaner. It could also save the health of millions of people around the world who are now living in cities with bad air quality. After the terrible fog of 1952, everyone realized how serious London's air problem was. 4 years later, the British authorities created a law called the Clean Air Act to stop something like that from happening again. This law banned people from burning smoky fuels like coal in their homes or in factory furnaces in some parts of the city. To help people adjust, the authorities gave them money so that they could switch to cleaner heating options like oil, natural gas, or electricity. It took time for these changes to make a big difference, and sadly, another dangerous smog happened in 1962. But the Clean Air Act was a very important first step for protecting the environment and people's health. Almost a century before the Great Smoke, another smelly event happened to London, the Great Stink. Back then, people didn't have proper bathrooms or sewers, and all the waste from houses and factories went straight into the River Thames. When the weather got super hot in July and August, the water level in the river went down, and piles of waste, sometimes 6 feet, popped up on the muddy banks. The smell was so terrible that even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had to cancel their relaxing boat ride on the river. The politicians working in the brand new Parliament buildings, which were right by the river, couldn't handle the smell either. The air inside was so terrible that they had to hold handkerchiefs over their noses to breathe. They even tried soaking the curtains in chloride of lime, hoping it would cover up the horrible odor. Many Londoners believe that the bad air, called miasma, caused horrible things like cholera, which had already taken the lives of lots of people. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette solved the problem as he built a new sewer system that would move all the waste away from the city. His sewer system was so well designed that it still works today, even though London has grown to over 8 million people. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, there was also a day when you couldn't see your hand before your face, and it was impossible to breathe outside. But the reasons for this Black Sunday were very different from the Great Smoke of London. In 1931, it almost completely stopped raining in the southern Great Plains. This drought lasted for nearly 10 years. Without rain, the farms dried up and the soil turned to dust. Strong winds blew this dry dirt into the air and created huge dust storms. These storms, called black blizzards, made it hard to breathe and see anything. People tried to protect themselves by putting Vaseline in their noses, wearing masks, and sealing their homes, but the dust still made many of them sick. In 1934, things got even worse. It was the driest year in over 1,000 years. Temperatures went over 100 degrees for weeks, and the land became even drier. On April 14, 1935, after months of terrible weather, the sky finally looked clear, and there was barely any wind, which was rare for this area. People came outside as they were hoping that the worst was finally over. When Oklahoma minister announced that a few good rainstorms would make the land fertile again. But unfortunately, that morning, a cold wind from Canada met warm air in the Dakotas and started a massive dust storm. The storm grew to hundreds of miles wide and thousands of feet tall. A sunny day instantly became completely dark. Drivers had to hide in their cars, and other people went down into basements, found refuge in barns, fire stations, tornado shelters, and under their beds to stay safe. The storm didn't stop for hours and took at least 20 lives. Many people couldn't stop coughing, and one man went blind. The storm was so strong, it carried 300,000 tons of dirt across the country and even reached the East Coast. You're wandering across the Sahara Desert and all you can see around is endless sand. And then, all of a sudden, you spot this mark in the sand. The wisest thing to do is run away from that spot as fast as you can. Because if you squint and focus really well, you'll realize that you're looking at a Saharan horned viper hiding in the sand, waiting for its next meal. Paradoxically, the bite of the snake has never led to human fatalities. But then, why should you run away? Well, let's find out. The Saharan horned viper is one of the desert's most famous snakes and a pro at hiding in plain sight. The Cerastes cerastes, which is this snake's scientific name, is one of the most well-camouflaged creatures in the entire animal kingdom. It can measure between 12 and 24 inches in length on average, but the biggest specimens can stretch up to a whopping 33 inches, nearly 3 feet. And while that might not seem too long, trust me, you wouldn't want one to sneak up on you. Interestingly, the females of this species are larger than the males, which is rare in snakes and gives the females an even more intimidating presence. But the truly unique thing about this viper is, of course, those creepy horns, one above each eye. They give the reptile a dragon-like look, setting it apart from most other desert vipers. Not all Saharan horned vipers have these horns. Some have small nubs or none at all. You could say it's a bit of a genetic lottery. Still, these horns add to the viper's threatening vibe and make it look even more fearsome. But it's not just their horns or size that makes them fascinating. Males and females look different beyond just their size. Males have noticeably larger heads and eyes than females. And compared to their relative, Saharan horned vipers have bigger heads and are more likely to sport these spooky horns. Now, let's talk about what makes the Saharan horned viper a true master of survival: its uncanny ability to blend into the sands. This viper's coloration matches the Sahara's various shades: yellow, pale gray, pinkish, reddish, or light brown. It has an intricate pattern along its back, with dark, semi-rectangular patches that sometimes fuse into crossbars. At the same time, the underbelly is white, and the tail often has a black tip. And here's another trick: some animals can mistake this feature for a scorpion stinger. This camouflage is the viper's main line of defense and its tool for hunting. The reptile doesn't just slither around in plain view. Instead, it buries itself in the sand. The viper can wiggle its body under the soft desert sand, leaving only its eyes and nostrils visible. Imagine a creature so skilled at hiding that it can lay completely flat and practically disappear, waiting for hours until an unsuspecting mouse or lizard or human wanders by. During the day, the viper also takes shelter under rocks and in burrows left by other animals. Sometimes it even simply hides in the shade of bushes. For a creature that looks so fierce, the Saharan horned viper is surprisingly even-tempered. It won't waste its venom on a threat it can avoid, preferring instead to lie still or try to hide. But when it feels truly threatened, the snake gives a truly dramatic warning. It rubs its coils together, producing a distinctive hissing and crackling sound that lets you know it's ready to strike. And if you ignore that warning, well, this viper's bite is loaded with toxic venom that can be quite dangerous. That's why handling such snakes can be a fatal mistake, as two unlucky handlers in Europe once discovered. Both men were bitten by captive Saharan horned vipers, and the bites caused extreme swelling, blood clotting issues, and even kidney failure. The venom in these bites has special compounds that mess with blood clotting, attack kidneys, and can cause serious internal bleeding. The best treatment for these bites is specific antivenom, but it's clear that the bite of a Saharan horned viper is nothing to take lightly. Now here's another astonishing fact about this reptile. When it does move, the Saharan horned viper doesn't slither in the usual way. Instead, it uses a unique style called sidewinding. Picture the animal lifting a loop of its body, moving that loop forward, and then pulling the rest along behind. This sideways walking lets the snake move across the hot sand without letting its belly touch the ground for too long. In a place as hot as the Sahara, this technique isn't just cool looking, it's essential for survival. While the Saharan horned viper is a champion of desert camouflage, it has some serious competition in the camouflage department. Around the world, there are other snakes that have protected the art of blending into their surroundings to catch prey and avoid being eaten themselves. Like the eastern brown snake, an Australian snake that is one of the most venomous in the world. Its brown color lets it blend in with rocks and soil, making it extremely hard to spot until you're practically on top of it. A bite from the snake can be fatal in less than an hour. Or the eastern copperhead, found in the forests of the U.S. This snake's pale tan and pinkish colors blend in perfectly with autumn leaves. It often freezes in place rather than slithering away, which leads to many accidental bites. Its venom usually isn't fatal, but it's painful, and since the reptile hides so well, encounters are common. The Perengaise adder, from Angola and Namibia, loves to hide in the sand like the Saharan horned viper. It mostly eats lizards, and its sandy-colored scales make it almost impossible to see. Thankfully, its bite isn't too dangerous for humans. Now look at this terrifying creature. It's the timber rattlesnake. This rattlesnake lives in the lush forests of the U.S. and uses its colors to blend into the forest floor. You might not see it, but if you hear its rattle, take a step back since its venom is potent. The Pacific gopher snake, found on the west coast of the U.S., can grow up to 7 feet long. The only plus in this situation is that this reptile is non-venomous. It camouflages well in forests and fields, but is harmless to people. Just don't scare it, or you'll get a bite, which is still unpleasant. In the rocky terrains of California and Oregon, you might meet the northern Pacific rattlesnake, which likes blending into dark brown and gold rocks. Hearing a rattle is often your only warning, since this dangerous snake is nearby. These neck snakes aren't particularly dangerous, but they're unsurpassed masters of camouflage. The smooth green snake has a bright green color that matches the leaves in trees and grass, which makes it practically invisible among foliage. The common European viper prefers hiding among leaves and shrubs, and the harmless common garter snake has colors that blend in with dirt and grass. Keep in mind, though, that even though all these snakes are not venomous, they can still give a painful nip. Oh, and I can't but mention the massive reticulated python. Even though it can grow over 21 feet, this South Asian snake is expert at hiding among leaves and shadows. It's one of the only snakes known to occasionally hunt humans, so tread carefully in its territory. Now, in the wild, snakes like the Saharan horned viper rely on camouflage to hunt and avoid being hunted. They might be blending into leaves, sand, or rocks, but in any case, these snakes have evolved to stay hidden from predators and prey alike. The desert viper buries itself to stay cool and catch food, while forest snakes blend in to hunt in silence or avoid curious humans. For them all, staying hidden isn't just a matter of survival, it's a huge advantage. So, next time you're out in nature, remember that you might be walking right past a hidden hunter, watching you from the shadows with a quiet, horrifying patience. Have fun out there.
The ground suddenly starts shaking. Clouds of gas start forming in the sky, making it dark during broad daylight. Bits of the ground start swelling, lifting, and even collapsing. These are the telltale signs of a volcano that is bound to erupt. And this is what could easily happen again with Mount Spur. It's only about 75 miles from Anchorage, one of Alaska's busiest cities. More than half of the population of the northernmost state of the US live there. There's also a huge amount of air cargo that passes through its international airport daily. So anytime a volcano this close to such a vital hub begins to get restless, people start paying attention. Just FYI, Approximately 350 million people in the world live within the danger range of an active volcano. That means that around 1 out of 20 people live in an area at risk of volcanic activity. Alaskans probably wish that Spur's reawakening was fiction, but it's actually true. The Alaska Volcano Observatory picked up on several of these "I'm about to erupt" signs from Mount Spur. So much so that they raised the alert level to yellow, which means unrest above normal background levels. Spur erupted twice in the 90s, and it was pretty intense. If we were ranking volcanic eruptions on a scale from 1 to 10, these eruptions would rank a 6 or 7. Not that terrible, but still worth 10 to 17 million in damages. However, these numbers are nothing compared to Alaska's 1988 Redoubt eruption, another volcano that erupted and summed up a staggering $345 million in damages, mainly because its ashes hit aircraft engines, such as the KLM 747 that lost power after all its engines went off due to the ashes. If people weren't paying attention to Alaska's unstable geology before that, well, they surely started to after it. When you think of the hazards of volcanic activity, the first thing that might possibly pop in your mind is Pompeii, Italy. Of course, that's the worst-case scenario, a city being engulfed by lava. Spur may seem innocent compared to Vesuvio, but it still took its toll. The last time it erupted in the 90s, and it threw volcanic aerosols over 60,000 feet into the atmosphere. Let's get our science straight here. Think of volcanic aerosols like liquid particles that are released into the atmosphere during an eruption. These particles are usually created when gases from a volcano, such as sulfur dioxide, combine with water and other particles that exist in our atmosphere. These aerosols can actually cool the Earth's surface since they reflect sunlight directly back into space. And that's not the worst part. It can stay in the atmosphere for several years after an eruption, causing lots of health issues. The eruption unleashed blazing fast avalanches of hot gas and ash called pyroclastic flows, along with thick, muddy floods known as lahars. Oh, and there were also the massive volcanic boulders. These rock chunks were huge, some over 3 feet long, and they blasted out from the volcano like nature's cannonballs, landing more than 6 miles away. All that volcanic heat melted part of a nearby glacier, kicking off debris flows that dammed up the Chakachatna River and created a whole new lake along the valley. Some good came out of Spur's first eruption, though. The main lesson was, volcanic monitoring pays off. The local monitoring was able to reduce the economic damage done by the eruption, especially for a city that has an intense air traffic. Spur is deemed as dormant for the moment, but it could go off anytime soon. You see, volcanoes are classified as active, dormant, or extinct, depending on how much action they're putting on. If it's still active, it's still rumbling and erupting somewhat regularly. Dormant means it's had some recent activity, but it's still lying low for now. And extinct, that's when it's been quiet for such a long time that we figure it's done for good. One of the US's most dangerous active volcanoes is Mount St. Helens. This volcano is actually responsible for the most powerful eruption in US history. Its last blast was so intense, it threw off about 1,300 feet off its summit. Basically, the top of the mountain vanished, and if you thought Mount Spur's ash cloud was impressive, St. Helens wins the competition since it launched its ashes 80,000 feet into the sky. Eastern Washington plunged into total darkness. But it wasn't just that. In a matter of 3 minutes, the eruption hurled 3.7 billion cubic yards of blazing rock and dust, enough to fill 1 million Olympic-sized pools across 230 square miles of lush forest. Actually, the earthquakes that anticipated the eruption started weeks before May 18, 1980. A ground shake of magnitude 5.0 went off, triggering a landslide on one side of the volcano. By the end of the official eruption date, 57 people, had lost their lives. Nearly 7,000 big game animals like deer and elk were wiped out, and millions of birds laid scattered on the burnt earth. Researchers don't think St. Helens will blow at the same magnitude again anytime soon, but they're keeping an eye on it, because this volcano is not exactly finished. By the way, the word volcano comes from the Roman name Vulcan, which was the Roman deity of fire, and they often happen at the meeting point of tectonic plates, which are the pieces of the Earth's surface that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. The so-called Ring of Fire, located in the Pacific Ocean, is the world's danger zone when it comes to volcanoes. It contains between 750 and 915 active volcanoes. The largest volcano located in the Ring of Fire, also the largest active volcano in the world, is the Mauna Loa. It's over 13,000 feet high, and it's located in Hawaii. Researchers say that Mauna Loa has been erupting for at least 700,000 years. Its most recent eruption began on the 27th of November 2022, and it lasted until December 13th. It's been quiet since the 80s until it decided to wake up again. Thanks to constant monitoring by the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, it didn't cause any casualties when it last erupted. Scientists have been investing big time on volcanic monitoring, not only to reduce economic hazards, but also to save lives. The most recent attempt has been to drill into volcanoes. Recently, a group of scientists went all the way to Iceland in one of the world's volcanic hotspots. There are around 33 active volcanoes in Iceland alone, but the one that is the most interesting to them the most is the Krafla volcano. The Krafla has erupted around 30 times in the last 1,000 years, and its most recent eruption was in the mid-1980s. The project named Krafla Magma Testbed, or KMT for short, is hoping to advance the understanding of how magma behaves underground. The main advantage of this drilling research is predicting the risk of eruptions, but it can also help to push geothermal energy forward. I mean, can you imagine having electricity that is run by the limitless source of volcano power? The KMT team will begin drilling holes deep into volcanic ground in 2027. They're aiming at reaching over a mile into the ground. After all, it's different to monitor lava activity when it's on the surface than when it is still below ground. This will allow researchers to listen to the pulse of the Earth, according to them. They're saying this research is as revolutionary as the first time man went to the moon. Oh, and speaking of that, I was shocked to discover that volcanoes exist all throughout the solar system. Yep, other planets and moons have volcanoes too. The largest volcano in our solar system is Olympus Mons on Mars. It's a shield volcano, much like the ones that make up the Hawaiian Islands. It's about 370 miles wide. If we transported it all the way back to Earth, it would almost occupy all of Poland. Yikes.
The year was 1865. It was a boom of migration worldwide, with novel places discovered and new settlements created. Without planes like we have now, a ship was the only way to escape from the old life and journey towards a new, hopefully brighter future. So, a voyage like that was quite a regular thing to do. More than 500 immigrants safely reached Queensland, and the ship was supposed to head back to London sometime later. It was indeed a long journey, but not many people were willing to return to England. After all, they had chosen to come to Australia to create a brand new life. So it was only natural that the ship would come back nearly empty. However, the return trip was still quite lucrative, thanks to the cargo the ship would carry. The amount of produce ready to be shipped was substantial, primarily consisting of wool soaked in arsenic, tallow, and hides. It was two birds with one stone. Not only could the crew wait out the winter, warm in Australia, while England endured bitter cold, but they also wouldn't waste their time. With the sheer volume of produce to be loaded, it would take them around 3 months to accomplish this task. Reports were circulating that the fiery star was almost done loading up, but it turned out that the assessment was a bit too optimistic. To pass the time, Captain Ewell thought it would be a good idea to reach out to the Acclimatization Society and offer to help transport any animals they wanted to send to England on the Fiery Star. He already had some emus and kangaroos on board, but there was still room. The society held a vote, and they were totally on board, pun intended, with Captain Ewell's idea. They figured sending some taligalas would be a great plan. Even though a few of these birds were already in England, the French Society needed a couple, and they could get them shipped there through England. Little did the crew know that all this cargo, all the produce they were willing to sell in England, would ultimately lead to the ship's destruction. Not only was the Fiery Star lost, but most of the people on board did not survive to complete the voyage. March 23rd. That was the day when the ship manifest was finally published. A manifest is a list that details the cargo, passengers, and crew of a ship, plane, or vehicle, primarily for customs officials. This document helps those involved in the transport verify that everyone and everything that was loaded is still on board when the vehicle reaches its destination. Once it's published, it means the ship is almost ready to depart. There were three possible ways of passenger accommodation. First, there was the saloon, the antiquated name for first class. Next, there was the second cabin, which is, logically, second class. Finally, there was the steerage, the cheapest form of passenger accommodation on a ship. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many people traveled from their homelands, often to North America and Australia, looking for a fresh start. Most of them were poor and had limited funds for travel. In total, there were 8 people in the saloon, another 8 in the second cabin, and only 21 steerage passengers. Out of the 37 passengers, only one, John Omond, would make it out alive. He bought a ticket for the steerage, so unlike the Titanic situation, in this case, the class didn't really matter. The crew members list wasn't as detailed as the passengers. It was known that, in total, there were around 55 people in the crew, from able-bodied seamen to crew members simply called boys. But there's something telling me that the crew wasn't really that important for the captain. In reality, all that mattered to him was to make as much money as possible, shipping tons of dangerous, flammable cargo. Out of over 50 crew members, only 17 survived that voyage. But there was actually one more crew member who actually survived it all, just because they weren't let in. Sarah Johnson disguised herself as a man and planned to sneak onto the ship. However, something about her looks made the captain get suspicious, so he called the police and made Sarah leave the ship as he didn't want any immoral behavior to take place. Well, he saved her life. For him, it was the last voyage. The captain, W. Hunter Ewell, was quite a celebrity apparently. He already had a record of the safe landing of immigrants in the previous year, so there seemingly was no reason to worry. The trip promised to be safe. Clipper Fiery Star left Moreton Bay bound for London. The passengers took their places. The cargo had already been loaded. The full list is astonishing. In addition to all the wool, tallow, cotton, hides, and horns, there were also 6 cases of arrowroot and various other packages. And we can't forget the animals the captain took aboard too. The Fiery Star was far away, yet still observable to the east as it headed toward the Pacific Ocean. This was the last information available until May 26, when news of its destruction emerged from Brisbane. Chief Officer William Sargent's log reveals that the Fiery Star took 12 days to reach the southern tip of New Zealand, passing on April 11, 1865. The trip was going well until heavy seas ruined 2 longboats on April 17. On this day, a strong odor of smoke alerted the captain. When he checked, he found the lower hold completely filled with smoke from a fire fueled by the ship's flammable cargo. The hatches were quickly closed to try to contain the flames, but by the next day, the heat and toxic smoke had forced passengers out of their cabins. George Maber was one of the lucky survivors. He was the ship's engineer, and he recalled the chaotic events on April 20th, as Captain Ewell and most of the crew and passengers tried to evacuate in rough weather. At around 6 p.m., the ship took on water, and without much warning, Captain Ewell, 4 crew members, and a few female passengers hopped into a lifeboat and headed out. The next boat, managed by the second mate, Mr. Adio, was a gig, followed by a crowded jolly boat. Lastly, there was a waste boat, which was barely seaworthy, with 2 men constantly bailing water to keep it afloat. The plan was for the boats to stay close to the Fiery Star overnight and head for the Chatham Islands the next morning. But by dawn on April 21st, all 4 boats had vanished without a trace. On the burning ship, there were 17 crew members and passenger John Oman, who banded together under Chief Officer William Sargent's leadership. For 5 days and nights, George Maber pumped water on the fire without rest. He volunteered to go down the forehatch with a rope around him and a handkerchief over his mouth. He discovered that the foremast had been burned through for about 7 inches, and the port side was severely damaged, resembling an empty shell. Exhausted, he returned for fresh air, but later descended again with Quartermaster Marshall to access a water tank. They couldn't open the lid, and as George crawled over the hides, he felt himself sinking. When they reached the deck, they collapsed from exhaustion. The cargo had been destroyed by smoke and fire, and the heat on the deck was intolerable. The crew survived on limited rations and caged chickens, using every spare piece of wood, including pigsties, for the pumps. Distressed pigs ran wild in the heat. A raft was constructed, but was too weak for the open sea. Sleep was elusive, and the crew had lost everything, with only hopes of reaching land or meeting another ship. Finally, the Dauntless appeared and sent a lifeboat to the Fiery Star. Captain Moore boarded the Fiery Star on May 12th, and after assessing the situation, he agreed that the crew could do no more. They boarded the Dauntless at 4 p.m., witnessing the Fiery Star succumb to flames by 11:30 p.m. It was a narrow escape. Ah, Phoenix. This sizzling gem in the Sonoran Desert isn't just another American city. It's more like a giant oven where you can throw a party, as long as you don't forget the ice. Seriously, if you find yourself here in the summer, brace yourself for some serious heat. We're talking about temperatures that regularly pass 100 degrees. And in 2024, Phoenix hit 110 degrees 55 times during the summer, tying the record set just the year before. Now, I get it if you're not a fan of hot weather, but apparently a lot of people love living in a sauna. Phoenix ranks as the 5th largest city in the United States, and it is the capital and most populous city in Arizona, with 1.7 million residents as of 2024. And if we're talking about the metropolitan area, also known as the Valley of the Sun, the population is almost 5 million. Yet, good luck finding someone actually born here. Out of every 4 Phoenix residents, 3 were born somewhere else. Believe it or not, Phoenix wasn't always this bustling, crowded place. It became one. A few decades ago, it was just a sleepy little dot on the map. Back in the 1940s, the population was around 65,000. It wasn't even close to cracking the top 100 list of the largest U.S. cities. Now, at that time, Phoenix was mostly an agricultural hub, and its economy revolved around what they called the 5 C's: cotton, citrus, cattle, climate, and copper. But things really started to change in the 1950s thanks to one life-changing invention. Drumroll please? The air conditioner. Actually, it was the portable version that came out in 1945, created by an American inventor named Robert Sherman. Phoenix residents owe a lot to Robert for making life bearable during scorching summers. Before AC, people in Phoenix would literally move their beds outside and build sleeping porches. They'd protect that kind of outdoorsy space with light curtains or some kind of net to keep the dust and bugs out. Fun. Anyway, the point is that the air conditioner played a big part in making Phoenix an easier place to live. Since the 1940s, this city in Arizona has transformed from a dusty little town into a sprawling urban jungle, and it's still one of the top 10 fastest-growing metro areas in the U.S. The best part is, it looks like that won't change anytime soon, since this 519-square-mile metropolis is surrounded by rolling desert, with plenty of room to keep growing as far as the eye can see. So, who's dropping everything to move to Phoenix? Well, Californians are the city's biggest fans. According to a recent survey, a third of all new renters moving to Phoenix come from Los Angeles. Okay, that survey might not be the most reliable since it only applies to the source's clients, but it does line up with U.S. Census Bureau data from 2019, which says that 70,000 Californians moved to Arizona in the previous year. The connection between Phoenix and LA is so strong that some people even call Phoenix the next LA. You've got to give Phoenix credit for capitalizing on its proximity to Southern California. The city offers lower taxes, fewer regulations, and lower costs of living, which makes it a magnet for businesses, especially in high-tech and service industries. So, in the 90s, Phoenix was considered a non-stop generator of jobs. In the last few years, we've seen the number of jobs only go up, and the unemployment rate has dropped by nearly half, going from 6.3 in January 2014 to 3.4 in the same month in 2024. Now, when it comes to big city problems, you can't avoid talking about traffic. But here's another reason why Phoenix is a dream city. It doesn't even come close to the traffic nightmares you find in places like LA. Estimates show that people in Los Angeles waste about 119 hours a year just sitting in traffic. But in Phoenix, it's more like 61 hours. Huge difference, huh? And let's not even start talking about the money people waste just sitting in traffic. In LA, drivers burn through about $2,440 worth of gas per year. In Phoenix, they waste 25 gallons of fuel, which ends up costing about $952. Yeah, that's still a lot of cash, but compared to LA, come on, that's a steal. Phoenix being okay in terms of traffic might have a lot to do with how the city was designed. Just take a look at a map of Phoenix. You'll notice it looks like someone took a ruler and drew perfectly straight lines for the roads. That's because the city was laid out in a grid system. This setup makes it so much easier to get around, especially compared to cities full of confusing twists, U-turns, and one-way streets. It just simplifies things, whether you're a local or a tourist. Plus, Phoenix has nice wide streets. Most cities have one major road and a bunch of narrow streets that just can't handle heavy traffic. But Phoenix has wide roads everywhere. So, when the freeways get jammed, you can just hop onto a parallel street and still get to work without stressing out too much. When you look at all the job opportunities and the relatively smooth traffic, it's no wonder people are willing to put up with the heat and move to Phoenix. But don't get it twisted, the heat is no joke. It is really, really hot and sunny out there. We're talking about 300 days of sunshine on average, or about 85% daylight hours per year. But once again, Phoenix has made the best of it. And all that constant sunshine has turned Phoenix into one of the top solar energy cities in the country. Now, you may be wondering, a city in the middle of the desert with barely any rain, do they actually have enough water? Well, they do. Phoenix has its water situation pretty well sorted out, thanks to multiple sources. I mean, they don't rely on rain alone, which is a good thing because, desert life. Most of their water comes from way up north and east of the valley, where snow melts off the mountains and flows into giant reservoirs, storing it up for those dry years. But most of Phoenix's water comes from the Salt River Project, which brings water through canals and pipelines from the Salt and Verde rivers. Then there is the Central Arizona Project, which transports water all the way from the Colorado River. They even get a bit of water from underground wells. And Phoenix doesn't want to waste a drop, so they're smart about recycling, reusing treated water to keep parks green, and even recharging their groundwater. Since Phoenix is all about sunny skies nearly every day of the year, it's normal that people can get a little moody when it actually rains. But here's the thing. Phoenix always gets a surprise up its sleeve, even when it comes to bad weather. When it rains in the deserts, locals get treated to this unique earthy smell. It's thanks to the creosote bush, a desert plant that releases an amazing fragrance when the rain hits it. People describe it as the smell of rain, and honestly, it's one of those fresh, clean scents that makes you forget you're in the desert for a second. And if you've never stopped to think about why Phoenix is called Phoenix, well, it's based on that famous legend of the bird that rises from the ashes. Now, after knowing all the special things about this city and its unique ability to turn challenges into advantages, we can say the name couldn't have been better chosen. These ominous rumbling sounds, the ground shaking under your feet. Wait a minute, that's my tummy. Or it might be Washington State's Mount Adams waking up. It's the largest volcano in the state by both area and volume, and it's recently started to show signs of life after staying silent for thousands of years. Scientists have noticed an alarming uptick in seismic activity around the mountain. And since the last eruption here happened between 3,800 and 7,600 years ago, humanity was still in the Stone Age at that time. This sudden chattiness has scientists, let's say, curious. The U.S. Geological Survey has hurriedly installed temporary seismic stations around Mount Adams to keep an eye on the situation. At the same time, they reassure the public there's no need to panic. Mount Adams doesn't reach the height of the better-known Mount Rainier, and still it covers a massive area, making it Washington's largest active volcano. Interestingly, records show that before September of this year, Mount Adams had experienced an average of just one small earthquake every 2 to 3 years since 1982. And then, the Cascades Volcano Observatory and the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network detected a staggering 6 earthquakes in just 1 month, September. These quakes were all rather tiny, with magnitudes ranging between 0.9 and 2 on the Richter scale. It means they were so weak you wouldn't feel them at the surface. Plus, satellite imagery confirmed there was no ground deformation in the area. Now, at the moment, the USGS keeps Mount Adams' alert level at green or normal, so we shouldn't worry about the ground opening and swallowing towns and cities. But the most recent seismic blips have encouraged the agency to install additional equipment for more precise monitoring. Such an expanded network will help scientists notice even the smallest earthquakes, which will help them understand what's happening under Mount Adams. This extra equipment might also shed light on whether this recent activity is a signal of future eruptions or just a random anomaly. If Mount Adams eventually erupted, it would likely produce slow-moving lava flows rather than explosive eruptions like Mount St. Helens. After all, past eruptions have only led to lava flows that travel just a few miles from the volcano, so that's not what we'd need to worry about. A much more dangerous thing would be lahars. These are mud flows that can happen when volcanic ash, rock, and melted ice mix during eruptions. Lahars have occurred near Mount Adams without even eruptions. Rock, weakened by hydrothermal processes at the volcano's summit, suddenly broke loose, creating fast-moving, destructive mud flows. Exactly for this reason, the USGS categorizes Mount Adams as a high-threat volcano. While it doesn't erupt frequently, it still poses serious risks to nearby settlements. Another volcano we should carefully watch is Katla in Iceland. It's one of the country's most powerful and dangerous volcanoes. It last erupted over a century ago in 1918, but if it erupts again, it could be 10 times as powerful as another Icelandic volcano whose name I can't pronounce. See? That one erupted in 2010, completely disrupting air travel all over Europe. An eruption of Katla could release large amounts of sulfur dioxide, which could form sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere. Such aerosols reflect sunlight, which could even cause temporary global cooling. This phenomenon often followed catastrophic volcanic eruptions in the past. Although eruptions are common in Iceland, Katla's ash cloud would likely shoot higher into the sky and cover larger areas of Europe than that other one did. It would ground flights and negatively affect economies. If Katla erupted, it would also harm agriculture, water supplies, and air quality. In 2014, scientists noted that a large eruption could even cause a tsunami that might travel along Iceland's south coast and out to sea. But the potential impact of such a tsunami is still unclear. Katla tends to erupt on a regular schedule every 40 to 80 years. which means that another eruption is statistically very likely soon. That's why Katla remains under close scientific observation. The Canary Islands' Cumbre Vieja erupted recently in 2021, reminding people of its destructive potential. The lava flow from this eruption was devastating. It covered whole neighborhoods and flowed into the ocean, destroying more than 3,000 homes. Thousands of people had to be evacuated. But the craziest thing? Even though the damage was significant, scientists believe it could have been far worse. A massive eruption of Cumbre Vieja could have caused the volcano's entire western flank to collapse into the Atlantic Ocean, triggering a mega tsunami. This hypothetical tsunami could have potentially created waves hundreds or even thousands of feet high. They could have flooded coastlines around the Atlantic Basin, including parts of the US and Europe. Luckily, recent studies claim that a collapse of that scale is unlikely. But even though the chance of a mega tsunami is low, scientists still think it's wise to prepare for possible eruptions because there's a chance of extensive damage. The lava flows that occur at this volcano tend to be extensive and dangerous to both human life and the infrastructure on the island. If you decide to travel to Ecuador, you should be wary of Cotopaxi, one of the most active volcanoes in this country. It's been rumbling with minor eruptions since 2022. While these eruptions have been relatively small, Cotopaxi has a great potential for a major eruption, and it has scientists on high alert. If Cotopaxi erupted on a large scale, it could produce a massive ash cloud over 12 miles high, threatening the lives of around 200,000 people in the neighboring area. A serious danger is Cotopaxi's snow-capped summit. It would melt super rapidly in a major eruption. It could lead to destructive floods and landslides that would flow down the mountain and potentially reach populated areas. This combination of volcanic activity and glacial floods makes Cotopaxi a high-risk volcano. A powerful eruption could occur soon, or it could be years or even decades away. But monitoring efforts are in place to catch any warning signs. The next volcano we should watch out for is already infamous, Mount Vesuvius. Its catastrophic eruption in 79 CE destroyed the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Its last eruption occurred in 1944, but Vesuvius remains highly active and poses a great risk to nearby Naples, one of Italy's largest cities. A large eruption would threaten over 3 million people. Many of them live in the vicinity or even directly on the slopes of the volcano. If Vesuvius erupted, it would be an explosive event, with ash, rocks, and volcanic gas ejected at extremely high speeds. And even though such a destructive event isn't expected for a few hundred years, Vesuvius remains one of the world's most closely watched volcanoes. After all, it has a real potential to cause catastrophic damage in a densely populated area. Then we have Popocatépetl, often called El Popo. It's one of North America's tallest active volcanoes, which lies about 40 miles from Mexico City. Exactly this proximity to a metropolitan area with a population of 22 million people makes Popocatépetl especially hazardous. A large eruption could send a massive ash cloud over Mexico City, causing widespread disruptions. Ash could clog the city's drainage systems, contaminate water supplies, and even cause power outages by short-circuiting electrical systems. Plus, lahars could rush down the volcano, reaching nearby towns. Popocatépetl has been showing near-constant seismic activity since the early 2000s, and smaller eruptions are pretty common here. In early 2024, there were 13 recorded minor eruptions, which alarmed nearby towns. At the same time, volcanologists consider such eruptions normal for Popocatépetl. While talking about super dangerous volcanoes, we can't skip Yellowstone National Park. It houses one of the world's largest supervolcanoes. Its last massive eruption occurred about 640,000 years ago. But if this monster were to erupt today, the impact would be much more devastating for the entire planet. States closest to Yellowstone, including Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, would be most affected, likely experiencing disastrous pyroclastic flows. These flows, which are made of a dangerous mix of lava, ash, and gases, can obliterate everything in their path. Large parts of the country would also be blanketed in volcanic ash, over 3 feet in some areas. On a global scale, an eruption at Yellowstone would send tons of ash and gases into the stratosphere, potentially blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to drop for a few years. This would disrupt agriculture, collapse transportation systems, and create food shortages on a massive scale. Still, even though there's a popular myth that Yellowstone is overdue for an eruption, geologists clarify that this isn't true. Volcanoes don't follow precise timetables, and the activity at Yellowstone doesn't indicate an imminent eruption. So yeah, that's good news.